The man who has survived more political near-death experiences than any leader in Israeli history is now facing the one threat his survival instincts were never designed to handle. I want to be transparent about how I came to this story because the framing matters. For months, I have been reading analysis that treats Netanyahu's grip on power as essentially unbreakable. The argument goes something like this. He has been written off before. He always finds a way. Israeli politics is too fragmented for any challenger to build a durable majority. And as long as the country is at war, voters do not change horses. I found that argument compelling for a long time. Then I looked at the actual numbers coming out of Israel this week, and I stopped finding it compelling. Because the numbers are not telling the story of a man who has found a way. They are telling the story of a man who is running out of ways to find. Here is what you need to understand before anything else, because it frames everything that follows. Netanyahu's governing coalition is not just under pressure. It is structurally breaking from within, not from the opposition. Not from foreign pressure, not from the courts or the streets, although both of those are also factors. It is breaking because one of the essential pillars of his coalition, the ultra-Orthodox political bloc that has kept him in power through multiple crises, has looked at what he offered them this week and said publicly in a formal statement that was not walked back and was not diplomatic, "We have no trust in Netanyahu anymore. We must move to dissolve parliament imminently." Those words were spoken by Degel HaTorah, the ultra-Orthodox faction whose Knesset seats Netanyahu cannot govern without. And before you file that under routine coalition drama, which Israeli politics produces with regularity, let me show you why this time is structurally different from the previous times. Because the previous times had an exit. This time, Netanyahu's options are narrowing in every direction simultaneously. The issue at the center of this collapse is military conscription. And to understand why it is so explosive, you need about 90 seconds of context. Israel has historically exempted young ultra-Orthodox Jewish men from mandatory military service to allow them to pursue religious study in yeshivas. That exemption has been controversial for decades among secular and centrist Israelis who argue it creates a two-tier system of sacrifice, especially during wartime. In 2024, with the Gaza war demanding sustained military manpower and reserve soldiers serving rotation after rotation, the Israeli Supreme Court did something it had avoided for years. It ordered the government to begin drafting ultra-Orthodox men. The court's ruling was not a suggestion. It was a legal mandate, and it put Netanyahu in a position that has no clean resolution. His ultra-Orthodox coalition partners, specifically Degel HaTorah and the larger Shas bloc, do not just prefer an exemption from the draft. For them, it is a civilizational requirement. The continuation of religious scholarship is, in their framework, not a lifestyle preference, but a foundational obligation that supersedes state military necessity. They have demanded repeatedly and with escalating urgency that Netanyahu pass legislation explicitly shielding their community from conscription. Netanyahu, caught between his coalition partners on one side and the Supreme Court, the military establishment, and a large portion of Israeli public opinion on the other, told ultra-Orthodox leaders this week that he could not advance that legislation now. He suggested it could happen after elections. To partners who have been waiting for 2 years, that is not an offer. That is a dismissal. And the response was immediate. The coalition partner called for parliament to dissolve. Elections are now widely expected to be called for September 2026. The question is not really whether the government falls anymore. The question is how it falls and what comes after. Now here is where the polling data becomes crucial, and I want to walk through it carefully because the headline numbers are more complicated than they first appear, and the complexity is where the real story lives. An April poll from Haaretz and Channel 12 put Netanyahu's current coalition at 51 seats in the 120-seat Knesset. Maariv placed it even lower, at 49. To govern in Israel, you need 61 seats. That means Netanyahu's bloc, even in the more generous projection, is 10 seats short of a functional majority. That shortfall is not a polling margin of error. That is a governing crisis. For a man who has built his entire political identity around the claim that only he can assemble and hold a coalition, 51 seats out of 120 is a statement about the current state of that claim. But here's the part that gets more interesting and that most of the coverage is not adequately explaining. The opposition is not simply winning either. The same polls show the Zionist opposition parties at approximately 60 seats and Arab majority parties at 9 to 10. The math means that neither side can form a governing majority without relying on parties the other side finds politically unacceptable. Netanyahu cannot govern without his ultra-Orthodox partners who are now demanding conditions he cannot meet. The opposition cannot govern without either right-wing parties that will not sit with them or Arab factions that significant portions of the Israeli electorate will not accept as coalition kingmakers. This is the specific kind of political deadlock that Israeli politics has experienced before. And the last time it produced this level of paralysis, it resulted in 5 elections in under 4 years. The new player in this equation is the Bennett-Lapid alliance, and this is where things get genuinely consequential. On April 26, 2026, former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett and opposition leader Yair Lapid announced the formation of a joint party called Beyachad, which means together in Hebrew. The alliance between a right-wing former prime minister and a centrist opposition leader is not a natural political marriage. It is a tactical response to a shared calculation. Separately, neither man has enough polling support to break Netanyahu's dominance of the right-wing voter base. Together, they create something that the Israeli electorate has not seen before, a cross-ideological challenge to Netanyahu from people who have both actually run the country. The early polling on the Beyachad alliance puts it at 27 seats. That number immediately generates a question. Is 27 seats enough? The answer requires some unpacking. 27 seats makes Beyachad one of the largest single parties in the Knesset under current projections. It does not by itself create a governing majority, but it does something more structurally important in the current environment. It consolidates the anti-Netanyahu right-wing vote in a way that makes it much harder for Netanyahu's Likud party to argue that only it can represent the security-minded Israeli voter who wants a strong hand but is exhausted by the perpetual crisis of the Netanyahu era. Bennett is not a leftist. He is not a peacenik. He is a right-wing former special forces officer who led the country through a difficult period and governed without Netanyahu. His presence at the head of the opposition removes the argument that replacing Netanyahu means moving Israel to the left on security. It does not mean that. It means replacing a man who is legally embattled, politically cornered, and governing a coalition that is collapsing, with someone who shares roughly the same security worldview but does not carry the same institutional weight around his neck. I have to stop here and address something I kept running into in my research because I think it is the honest version of the counter-argument and it deserves real treatment before I explain why I think the situation is more serious than it suggests. The pushback from analysts who think Netanyahu survives this crisis goes like this. He has been here before. In 2020 and 2021, when Israeli politics was cycling through election after election, Netanyahu retained his position as the dominant force in Israeli politics despite multiple failed coalition attempts by his opponents. The Israeli right-wing electorate, which has consistently given Likud the largest single-party share of the vote, has not abandoned him. His personal brand of security-first politics remains more trusted by a plurality of Israeli voters than any alternative. And there is a specific dynamic in wartime Israeli politics where the public, even when it is critical of a government, tends to pull back from the brink of change out of risk aversion. Elections in September, with Israeli forces still engaged in conflicts on multiple fronts, may produce a result that looks like the current deadlock rather than the clean change the opposition is projecting. That is a serious argument. The historical record of Netanyahu's resilience is not fabricated. He is genuinely the most durable politician in Israeli history across multiple crisis cycles. So, why do I think this time is structurally different? 3 reasons, and they compound each other. The first is the legal dimension. Netanyahu is currently on trial for corruption charges that have been moving through the Israeli court system since 2021. The trial is not concluded. A conviction, if and when it comes, would create constitutional and political pressures of a kind that his previous crises did not involve. The Supreme Court's intervention on the ultra-Orthodox draft was already a demonstration that the Israeli judiciary is willing to act against coalition interests in ways that Netanyahu cannot simply override. The legal environment around this government is not background noise anymore. It is an active variable. The second is the military exhaustion factor, and Chatham House published a detailed analysis of this in April 2026 that I think is the most important piece of analysis on Israel that most people haven't read. The paper documents what it calls the limits of Netanyahu's Super Sparta model, the governing philosophy that Israel can sustain perpetual high-intensity military mobilization as a long-term state of national being. The paper's core finding is that Israeli reserve soldiers, the backbone of the military's operational capacity, are now serving at rotation frequencies that are significantly above historical norms, with measurable impact on civilian economic productivity, family stability, and crucially, on reserve soldiers' own political views. Reserve soldiers who are on their fourth or fifth multi-week rotation since October 2023 and who see ultra-Orthodox men of the same age in full-time religious study are not a politically stable constituency for a prime minister who has been unable or unwilling to resolve that inequity. The military exhaustion argument does not require the Israeli public to turn pacifist. It requires them to ask whether the current leadership has managed the burden of war fairly. The polls suggest a growing number are asking that question and not liking the answer. The third reason is the Gaza dimension, which operates as the emotional backdrop for all of the above. The October 7th attacks and the subsequent war in Gaza are, at their core, the lens through which the Israeli electorate is evaluating Netanyahu's fitness to govern. The coming election is widely described by analysts as a referendum on October 7th, not just on what happened before it, but on what has happened since. The question of whether the intelligence failure, the military response, the humanitarian consequences, and the diplomatic isolation Israel has experienced over the past 2 years constitute a record that deserves continued confidence is a question that 51 polling seats answers in a particular way. And that number was collected before the ultra-Orthodox coalition partner issued its dissolution statement this week. The data is likely to move further. Now let me bring this down to what it actually means beyond the polling numbers and the coalition arithmetic, because at some point, political analysis has to connect to consequences that affect people who are not Knesset members. If Israel enters an election cycle in September 2026, the immediate practical consequence is a caretaker government through the campaign period. A caretaker government in Israel does not have the authority to make major policy decisions. That means ongoing military operations continue under existing authorization, but significant new initiatives require either emergency procedures or wait for a new government to be seated. In a conflict environment where the situation on multiple fronts is still active, a period of governmental transition creates decision-making gaps that adversaries can, and historically do, attempt to exploit. This is not theoretical. The 2021 Israeli election cycle, which produced political stalemate, coincided with a period of Hamas activity that many analysts believe was partly calibrated around Israeli domestic paralysis. For the Israeli economy, which has been operating under war conditions since October 2023, an election period extends the period of policy uncertainty that is already suppressing investment and economic activity. The shekel has been one of the more volatile currencies among developed economies over the past 18 months. Foreign direct investment into Israel dropped significantly in 2024 and 2025. A new government that can make stable, long-term policy commitments is, paradoxically, what the Israeli economy needs most urgently. Getting to that government requires an election. The election requires the current government to fall. And the current government falling means a transition period of further uncertainty before the stability on the other side of it. For Israelis who have spent more than 2 years in varying states of emergency, with family members in reserve service, with rockets falling on northern cities from Hezbollah, with the weight of international criticism accumulating in ways that affect travel, academic exchange, and cultural engagement with the outside world, the election is not just a political event. It is a referendum on whether the country's leadership has spent the capital of their sacrifice wisely. The polls are saying, with increasing consistency, that a majority of Israeli voters think the answer to that question is no. Not because they have stopped caring about security, because they have concluded that this particular government's management of security and of the civilian costs that security demands has not been good enough. Here is what I keep coming back to after everything I have laid out. Netanyahu has always understood one thing about Israeli politics better than almost anyone, that fear and the credible claim to manage fear better than any alternative is the most durable currency in Israeli electoral politics. He has spent 30 years building his identity around that currency. The unprecedented challenge he faces right now is that the fear is real. The wars are real, the threats are real, and a growing portion of the Israeli electorate has concluded that the fear is at least partly a consequence of his decisions rather than purely a condition he is uniquely equipped to manage. When a leader loses the argument that the crisis requires them specifically, they have lost the core of their political identity. Netanyahu has not lost that argument yet, but 51 seats in a 120-seat parliament, an ultra-Orthodox coalition partner calling for dissolution, a Bennett-Lapid alliance polling at 27 seats, and a September election looming suggest that the argument is considerably weaker than it has been at any previous point in his remarkable political career. Israel has been here before. Netanyahu has survived before. The difference this time is the number of things that are failing simultaneously, and the degree to which those failures are compounding rather than canceling each other out. What would it take for Netanyahu to find a way through this? That is the question I genuinely do not have a confident answer to. And for a politician whose entire career has been built on always having an answer, that might be the most significant data point of all.